Hello guys, welcome to FDR India. Today we have with us Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan to discuss an important issue. Hello sir.
Hello, Ankit.
Hi. So the Lok Sabha has passed the Government of National Capital Territory of Delhi Amendment Bill, and the AAP government and the opposition parties have uh, called it attack on federalism because it seeks to amend the powers of the lieutenant governor, gives the lieutenant governor powers in respect to the civil services. How do we read this, sir?
Ankit, as a principle, what we need in India is more and more decentralization. Our bias must be in favor of decentralization because we tend to be a very highly centralized government. Let's go back to the pre-independence days. There's one striking example of British government acknowledging the importance of people's mandate in local governments and honoring it. In Kolkata city, Chittaranjan Das was elected as the, let's say in today's parlance, municipal chairman of Kolkata in 1924. The designations were different in those days. 1924. He got a clear majority, his team. The officials of Bengal presidency, they complimented him, and he already was a man of national stature. And Chittaranjan Das leveraged his position, his stature, to demand that he must have the right to appoint a commissioner, in those days called chief executive officer, of his choice. The British government said, we'll give you an officer of your choice. He said, no, I don't need your officers. I will employ somebody of my choice from within the citizenry. And the government, because of his stature, and maybe they want to test his resolve, they said, okay. He appointed a 27-year-old young man as the chief executive, the municipal commissioner equivalent today, from the citizens, among the citizens. That young man did an outstanding job for about 9 or 10 months. Earned the appreciation of the people, the elected councillors, and the British officials. He was jailed in Alipur jail in Calcutta, not for any misappropriation or corruption, but because of his involvement in freedom struggle. In those days, I think non-cooperation movement. And Das again went to the British officials and said, you allowed me to appoint a man of my choice. He did an outstanding job. He was arrested for an extraneous reason, his participation in freedom struggle. I will not pick up an issue on that now. But he must continue as commissioner. I don't care what you do or how you do. In an extraordinary order, the British government passed a direction saying that this young man, while he was in jail in Alipur, will continue to be the municipal commissioner or chief executive. Files will be circulated to him and his orders will be implemented. And this practice continued until he was moved to Mandalay jail in today's Burma. Now, I hesitate to state in public because people convicted of corruption may claim the right to continue to be chief ministers and ministers and exercise powers. That's not the intention. To show that even during British Raj, how the local governance and people's mandates are respected by the British officials. And that young man then rose to be the mayor of Kolkata city later. He became AICC president. And then he founded the Azad Hind Fauj. He is none other than Subhash Chandra Bose. That is a remarkable tradition of local governments in India during British time. Around the same time in 1924 or thereabout, Jawaharlal Nehru, your Babu Rajendra Prasad, then Patel, Sardar Patel, Vallabhbhai Patel, his brother Vittalbhai Patel, and much earlier, I think in the year 1912 or so, in Salem city, the Rajaji, redoubtable Rajaji. Even before that, in Andhra, in Rajamandri, Tangutur Prakasham, and many others, they all rose through local governments. During the colonial era, they became prominent national leaders and outstanding national leaders. Local governments are schools for democracy. And if we don't allow local democracy and local leadership to flourish, our democracy and elections in large part become symbolic, not substantive. People vote without even knowing the consequences. And that is the central reason why our democracy is now in difficulties. The vote buying, the caste under the mobilization, short-term individual welfare measures at the cost of the larger public good. All these are the serious flaws in our democracy. They're all directly resultant from centralization. That's the context in which you must shape this debate. Now, come to Delhi. As a principle, I believe if even a local government must have enough autonomy for the local elected council to make a choice about its own civil servants or bureaucracy, and must be accountable, the bureaucracy must be accountable to the elected local government, the principle must apply to union territories as well, wherever there are elections. And Delhi has elections. And Delhi has a very special dispensation under the constitution. They created a legislative assembly. They gave the nomenclature, though it's not really equal to the state cabinet, nomenclature of the state cabinet. But the constitutional provision says, even in respect of subjects that are entrusted to the legislature of Delhi to enact laws, the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi has the final say. He is not bound by the advice of the Council of Ministers. And if there is a dispute between the Chief Minister and the Lieutenant Governor, the matter shall be referred to the President, namely the Union Government. That's what the Constitution says. The Supreme Court in its judgment did not clearly say this is unconstitutional. But nevertheless, its operational portion is basically overruling this provision. That insofar as the Delhi legislature has competence to make laws in respect of certain matters, in all those matters, executive jurisdiction must be coterminous with legislative jurisdiction, is the argument. But what happens to the constitutional provision explicitly made in this regard, because it's not just another thing, it's the Constitution of India. It may have been through an amendment, but it's the Constitution of India. Enacted, I think, during the Congress UPA time. It was not done, if I'm not mistaken, it was not done by the NDA government later. So you cannot ignore that. So what exactly happens? In my mind, there is a bit of a confusion. What exactly did the court envisage? The court conveniently skirted it. Now, what the union government has done, from what you see, the objectives of the bill introduced and passed by Lok Sabha, is that under 41, item 41 of the list 2, that is the state's list, the services, state public services, are with the state government, obviously. Now, because in the constitutional amendment related to Delhi, an explicit provision is made that the parliament can enact a law to determine the way it is operated. Now, this law is sought to be enacted. So, on a principle, I think we must decentralize. But the constitutional text and the provisions that have been there for quite some time now indicate that Delhi government is not like any other state government. That's not the intention of the constitution makers. And finally, from our point of view as citizens from all over India, while we all want local governments to have autonomy, that must be a non-negotiable principle, Delhi, in a large, diverse federal polity, is the capital of the nation. Therefore, whatever is done, in whatever manner it is done, it must retain the character of the national capital. Therefore, while Delhi people have a right to determine many issues related to their lives, Delhi is still the property of the whole of India, all people of India. And therefore, that unique character also must be retained. So my sense is probably the Rajya Sabha, depending on the majority, the government may prevail finally. And then the matter will be tested in courts. The Supreme Court this time will not be able to skirt this issue. Is this legislation valid or not? If it's not valid, are they saying that the constitutional amendment itself is valid? Is not valid to that extent. So that's a more thorny question that will be decided. But I hope the twin principles, one, local autonomy, respecting the mandate of the people, and two, the unique character of Delhi, and therefore it belongs to all the people of India, and to that extent, union government cannot be completely divested from the role. So I think we must marry these two diametrically opposite principles.
So, sir, another aspect of this amendment bill is that it seeks to introduce something called National Capital Civil Services Authority, and it confers upon the powers to transfer and posting of officers. So, do you think we need some kind of a body, because we've seen that in states in general, politicians their time is a lot of their time is taken for in transfers and posting of these officers. So, do you think this body?
So there is a lot of demand from various quarters in the states to have a civil services board. I am told by no less an authority than a former cabinet secretary that there were cases earlier in UP when the average tenure of an officer in some departments was 1 month. 1 month. We've gone to ludicrous levels. This is just not conducive to good administration or sound democracy. While the authority of the elected government is sacrosanct in a democracy, it cannot be capricious and malicious. And 1 month tenure for an official, unless there are extraordinary circumstances within 1 month something dramatic happened, is absurd, is ridiculous. So we do require some kind of a professional mechanism. In the olden days, like for instance the Madras presidency, it may or may not have been the practice in Bombay presidency and Kolkata presidency. In Madras presidency, the Board of Revenue acted as some kind of a civil services board. It was a board of very senior functionaries. But these boards were abolished later on. In Andhra Pradesh, for instance, sometime in the 70s they were abolished, combined Andhra Pradesh. Tamil Nadu, probably around the same time they were abolished. So while the Board of Revenue nomenclature may continue or many procedures and rules may continue, as an institution it has lost its relevance. I think therefore there is a case to have a civil services board, but the composition in states must be different. I think it must be by a group of officials of a certain stature, including the Chief Secretary, Chief Commissioner of Land Revenue or Land Administration, or CLR, Commissioner of Land Revenue, we say, and some other very senior functionaries of government, sitting as a collective body and making recommendations to the government. Ordinarily, they should be accepted unless there is a reason why the government, the political party of the government, opposes it. And once appointed, there must be a guaranteed tenure. Similarly, for the police, you must add the Director General of Police and Home Secretary, etc., to ensure that. So I believe there is a case for that, because civil services have now become completely tools in the hands of capricious political executive without really considering the public interest. And therefore, while, let me repeat, the final authority of the elected government is sacrosanct in a democracy, that power must not be unchecked. There must be institutional mechanism. That's why many eminent scholars all over the world, whether it is Fukuyama or people like Farid Zakaria, many others, they're arguing for institutions. What do they mean by that? The idea is that democracy does not mean that you violate every rule, you subvert every rule. Election is not a revolution. So while in making policies and executing them, utilizing public money and making appropriate laws, the elected government is substantially free within the bounds of the constitution and the fiscal rules. There must be some other institutional mechanisms to make sure that the government runs on an even keel. Otherwise, if every government acts like a tughlaq, what was the thing about tughlaq? The capriciousness. Government is a continuing entity, a permanent entity. And therefore, unless there is a permanent executive accountable to the political executive and yet functions professionally and with a degree of fairness and impartiality that is required, and appointments are made professionally based on competence and integrity, not political whim, then the country will be poorly served and even the elected government will be poorly served. Therefore, I believe without undermining the sovereignty and the authority of the elected government, we do require independent civil service boards in states. At the national level, there's something like that. There's a committee headed by the cabinet secretary to look at the appointments, and they propose the names and the panels. And finally, the cabinet committee of the union government, headed by the prime minister, makes a decision. By and large, they go by the committee of the officials there. I think some such procedure is required in the country.
Thank you, sir, for putting this issue into perspective.